Welcome to the Warfront Stories World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. January 21st, 1943, 1915. Central Tunisia. The winds howled across the desolate mountain pass, carrying with them the fine particles of sand that seemed to get into everything. Eyes, ears, weapons, food. As darkness fell over the rugged terrain of the Atlas Mountains, Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters of the 1st Infantry Division scanned the horizon through his binoculars, squinting against the dust. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it always did in the desert at night, but that wasn't the reason for the chill that ran down his spine. "Something's coming," he muttered to his radio man, though he couldn't yet see it. After months in North Africa, the men of the Big Red One, the nickname for the 1st Infantry Division, had developed a sixth sense for danger. Behind them, the Kasserine Pass cut through the mountains like a wound, a strategic corridor that, if lost, would expose the entire Allied position in central Tunisia. Waters lowered his binoculars and wiped grit from his eyes. 20 miles to the east, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, was gathering his forces. Intelligence reports indicated that elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer divisions were on the move. The 1st Infantry Division was dug in, along with elements of the 1st Armored Division. But Waters couldn't shake the feeling that they were woefully unprepared for what was coming. What unfolded over the next few weeks would become one of the most brutal chapters in the North African campaign. A horror story written not in ink, but in the blood of thousands of young men. Their bodies would be torn apart by steel and fire in the narrow confines of a mountain pass that most Americans couldn't even find on a map before shipping out. For those who survived, the psychological scars would run far deeper than the physical ones. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was about to begin, America's first major engagement against the German army in World War II. It would be a baptism in blood, a nightmare landscape where inexperience met tactical genius, where men learned the true meaning of terror, and where 6,000 Americans would meet their end or suffer terrible wounds. What follows is not fiction. Every detail, every name, every horror described herein is based on documented historical events. This is the true story of what happens when men meet in battle, stripped of civilization's veneer, exposed to the raw brutality of industrial warfare. January 23, 1943, 1430, Tunisia. Captain James T. Reston of the 1st Infantry Division sat in the makeshift command post, a canvas tent half buried in the rocky soil for protection. Outside, men of the 26th Infantry Regiment were digging into defensive positions across the rugged terrain. The scratching of shovels against hard ground had become a constant background noise, like the buzzing of flies. "They're digging shell scrapes, not foxholes," Reston observed with a frown to Lieutenant Henry Cabot, who stood beside him studying a map. "Shallow depressions rather than proper holes." "They're tired, sir. We've been on the move for days," Cabot replied, his voice hoarse from the dust. "Well, they'll be dead if they don't dig deeper. German tanks will roll right over those scrapes, crushing the men inside." Reston's words carried a grim certainty born of experience. But many of the men were replacements, fresh off the boats from America. They hadn't yet learned what war against the Germans truly meant. The division had taken up defensive positions along a 50-mile front in the eastern dorsal mountain range of Tunisia. The nearest settlement was the small village of Thala, barely more than a collection of mud brick buildings and palm trees. To their east lay Sidi Bouzid, and beyond that, the Afrika Korps. The intelligence officer entered the tent, bringing with him a swirl of dust and the latest reports. "Rommel's forces have taken Tripoli," he announced. "The British 8th Army is pursuing, but they're still weeks away." Reston studied the map, tracing his finger along the contours of the mountains. "So we're the only thing standing between Rommel and a clear path to Algeria," he said quietly. "With the supplies and reinforcements he's receiving through Tunis, he'll be looking to punch through our lines." The truth was that the American forces were scattered too thinly across the front. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the U.S. Corps, had ordered his units to spread out, against the advice of his subordinates. The 1st Armored Division was fragmented, with Combat Command A positioned nearly 30 miles away. The Allied front was a patchwork of isolated units, vulnerable to a concentrated attack. As dusk approached, the temperature plummeted. Reston stepped outside the tent and surveyed the bleak landscape. In the distance, the silhouette of the mountains stood like dark sentinels against the fading light. The wind carried strange sounds, perhaps just the movement of animals or the shifting of rocks, or perhaps something else. "Sir," called the radio operator from inside the tent. "Message from headquarters. German recon planes spotted over Faid Pass." Reston's jaw tightened. The Germans were probing, looking for weaknesses, and they would find them. January 30, 1943, 0610, Faid Pass, Tunisia. The pre-dawn darkness was shattered by the scream of artillery shells. Lieutenant Paul Robinette of Combat Command B, 1st Armored Division, was thrown from his cot as the first barrage hit the American positions. Dust rained down from the ceiling of the command bunker as the earth shook. "They've launched the attack!" shouted Major William Tuck as he stumbled into the room, his face gray with dust. "German armor, at least 2 battalions, coming through Faid Pass." Robinette grabbed his helmet and pistol. "Alert all units, get those tanks moving." But the American response was already too late. The French forces guarding the mountain pass had been overwhelmed in the initial assault by the German 21st Panzer Division. Within hours, more than 100 German tanks and half-tracks were pouring through the gap in the mountains. At 08:15, the first Panzer IV tanks appeared on the horizon, their long 75mm guns seeming to point directly at the American positions. Behind them came waves of infantry, moving with the precision that had made the Wehrmacht the most feared army in the world. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Frank Valenti of the 1st Infantry Division as he peered through his binoculars. "There's hundreds of them." The American M3 Stuart light tanks of the 1st Armored Division moved to counter the German advance, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Their 37mm guns couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of the German Panzer IVs. One by one, they brewed up into pillars of oily black smoke that stained the clear desert sky. By midday, the situation had become critical. The German forces had split into 2 powerful columns, one heading north and one south, threatening to encircle the entire American position at Sidi Bouzid. Colonel William Waters of the 1st Infantry Division received the radio call from the forward positions. The voice on the other end was barely audible over the sound of gunfire and explosions. "They're through our lines," the voice crackled. "Tanks everywhere, infantry being cut down. Request immediate—" The transmission ended in a burst of static. Waters turned to his operations officer, his face grim. "Get everyone on the line. We're about to be hit, and hit hard." As the sun set over the Tunisian mountains, the day's toll became clear. Over 300 American soldiers had been killed or wounded, dozens of tanks destroyed, and critical ground lost. But this was just the beginning. In the hastily established field hospital behind the lines, Army surgeons worked through the night by the light of kerosene lamps. The wounded arrived in a steady stream, many with horrific injuries from high explosive shells or machine gun fire. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. James Harlow said quietly to a nurse as he amputated the mangled leg of a young private. "Some of these men look like they've been torn apart by animals." Outside in the darkness, the distant rumble of tanks could still be heard. The Germans were regrouping for the next day's assault, and they were coming. February 14th, 1943, 5:30, Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. The morning air was bitter cold as Colonel Thomas Drake of the 168th Infantry Regiment, 34th Division, attached to 1st Armored Division, checked his watch. His men were positioned on 2 prominent hills, Jebel La Souda and Jebel Ksiara, that overlooked the strategic crossroads town of Sidi Bouzid. Between them ran Highway 13, the vital supply route. "Movement," reported Lieutenant Evans, lowering his binoculars. "Multiple enemy columns." Drake raised his own binoculars. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least 60 German tanks were advancing across the plain. the early morning sun glinting off their armor. Behind them came trucks filled with infantry and self-propelled guns. "My God," Drake whispered, "it's a full-scale offensive." The attack had been meticulously planned by Rommel and his officers. Two powerful Panzer battle groups struck simultaneously from different directions. From the east came Kampfgruppe Ziegler with elements of the 10th Panzer Division, while from the north emerged Kampfgruppe Riemann with the bulk of the 21st Panzer Division. The American forces were caught in a deadly pincer movement. The 168th Infantry Regiment found itself isolated on their hilltop positions, cut off from support as the German armor swept around them. At 0945, Colonel Drake attempted to radio for reinforcements. "We are surrounded," he reported. "German armor has bypassed our positions and is moving west. Request immediate support." The response from headquarters was not encouraging. No reserves were immediately available. The 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A was ordered to counterattack, but they would not arrive for hours. By 11:30, the situation had become desperate. German artillery pounded the American positions on the hills, while Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky, their sirens creating a distinctive howling sound designed to terrorize those below. Private Michael Ranieri of the 1st Infantry Division crouched in his shallow scrape as the earth erupted around him. "They're zeroing in on us," he shouted to the man next to him, only to find that his comrade's face had been torn away by shrapnel, leaving a red ruin behind the helmet. Ranieri vomited, then crawled deeper into his hole as another shell landed nearby, showering him with dirt and stone fragments. The air was filled with the screams of wounded men. By mid-afternoon, the German forces had complete control of the battlefield. The American counterattack, when it finally came, was piecemeal and uncoordinated. 33 M4 Sherman tanks of Combat Command A charged across the open ground, only to be picked off one by the well-positioned German 88mm anti-tank guns. "It's a turkey shoot," reported a German officer to General Ziegler as they watched the American tanks burn. "They're attacking without infantry support, across open ground." By nightfall, the American forces had lost 46 tanks, 59 half-tracks, 26 artillery pieces, and suffered over 1,000 casualties. The road to Spatla and beyond it, Kasserine Pass, now lay open to the German advance. In the darkness, small groups of American soldiers attempted to make their way back to friendly lines. Many were hunted down by German patrols. Others died of exposure in the freezing desert night, their wounds untreated. Lieutenant James Gordon of the 1st Infantry Division led a group of 15 men through a dry riverbed, trying to evade German patrols. "Stay low, stay quiet," he whispered. "The Germans have night vision equipment." Behind them, Sidi Bou Zid burned, the flames casting an orange glow against the night sky. The crack of small arms fire echoed through the darkness as German units mopped up the remaining resistance. Only 6 of Gordon's 15 men would make it back to American lines. The others fell to German bullets or landmines. The horror of Sidi Bou Zid would be seared into the memories of the survivors forever. February 15, 1943, 1400, west of Sidi Bou Zid, Tunisia. The remnants of the American forces retreated westward in disarray. Vehicles clogged the narrow desert roads, many breaking down due to the harsh conditions. Wounded men lay in the back of trucks, bouncing painfully with every pothole and bump. Captain Henry Miller of the 1st Infantry Division stood at a crossroads, directing the flow of traffic. His uniform was caked with dust and blood, not his own, but from a wounded man he had helped load onto an ambulance earlier. "Keep moving!" he shouted at a convoy of trucks. "The Germans are right behind us." Indeed, advance elements of the 21st Panzer Division were less than 5 miles away and closing fast. The retreat was rapidly becoming a rout. Major General Orlando Ward, commander of the 1st Armored Division, attempted to establish a defensive line east of Spatla, but the scattered American units were in no condition to make a stand. Equipment had been abandoned in the hasty retreat. Communication was in chaos, and the men were exhausted and demoralized. "We need time," Ward told his staff officers at the hastily established command post in Thala. Time to regroup, to bring up reinforcements. But time was the one thing they did not have. The German forces, sensing victory, pressed their advantage. By evening, the first German tanks were visible on the eastern horizon, approaching Thala. Throughout the night, the sounds of battle drew closer. Artillery fire illuminated the clouds like distant lightning. The wind carried the rumble of tank engines. In the field hospital at Thala, Dr. Michael Stern worked frantically to save as many of the wounded as possible before the inevitable evacuation. The hospital had received over 300 casualties in the past 24 hours. "We have to move them," a nurse told him, her eyes wide with fear. "The Germans will be here by morning." Stern looked down at the soldier on his operating table, a young private with multiple shrapnel wounds to his abdomen. "He won't survive being moved," Stern replied grimly. "What choice do we have?" the nurse asked. There was no answer to that question. By dawn, the field hospital would be abandoned, with only the most critically wounded left behind, with a few volunteer medical staff under a Red Cross flag. Whether the Germans would respect that flag remained to be seen. As February 16 dawned, the American forces completed their withdrawal from Thala, destroying bridges and laying mines to slow the German advance. But it was merely delaying the inevitable. The road to Kasserine Pass now lay open, and beyond it, the Allied supply bases in Algeria. The casualty reports told a grim story. By the night of February 16th, two corps had lost over 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. The cream of America's armored force in North Africa had been shattered in just 3 days, and the worst was yet to come. February 17th, 1943, 11. German headquarters, Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood over a map table in the captured American command post, studying the tactical situation. At 51, his face was deeply lined from years in the desert sun, his uniform impeccable despite the harsh conditions. "The Americans are broken," said Colonel Fritz Bayerlein, his chief of staff. "Their lines have collapsed. We have a clear path to Tebessa." Rommel nodded slowly. The success of the past 3 days had exceeded his expectations. The American forces had proven to be poorly led and tactically naive. Their tanks had attacked without infantry support, their artillery had been poorly coordinated, and their command structure had dissolved under pressure. "We have achieved all our objectives for the first phase," Rommel said, "but now we have an opportunity to expand our aims." He traced his finger along the map, following the line of the western dorsal mountains. "If we strike northwest through Kasserine Pass, we can isolate the British 5th Corps, destroy the U.S. 2nd Corps, and potentially drive the British First Army out of Tunisia entirely." It was an audacious plan, typical of the man known as the Desert Fox. But Rommel knew his forces were also stretched thin. Fuel was in short supply, and his men had been fighting continuously for days. "We must act quickly, before they can reorganize," he said. "I will seek Field Marshal Kesserine's approval to resume the attack on the 19th. As Rommel's staff officers prepared the necessary orders, the Field Marshal stepped outside the command post. In the distance, he could see the distinctive silhouette of the Kasserine Pass cutting through the mountains. It was there that the next phase of the battle would be decided. What Rommel could not know was that his success would ultimately prove to be a double-edged sword. The shock of defeat would galvanize the American High Command into making radical changes. The lessons learned in blood at Kasserine would transform the U.S. Army into a far more formidable fighting force. But for now, Rommel prepared to deliver the coup de grace to the reeling Americans. The Kasserine Pass awaited, and beyond it, the possibility of a strategic victory that might change the course of the North African campaign. At 13:30 on February 19th, Rommel received the Commando Supremo's agreement to his revised plan. The final assault would begin that same day. February 19, 1943, 05:15. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters of the 1st Infantry Division stood atop a rocky outcrop, watching as the first light of dawn revealed the narrow defile of Kasserine Pass. The pass itself was no more than 2 miles wide, a gap in the grand dorsal chain of the Atlas Mountains. The terrain was forbidding, jagged rocks, steep slopes, and minimal cover. "Not exactly ideal defensive terrain," remarked Captain Lewis, who stood beside him. Waters nodded grimly. "It's going to be a slaughter if Rommel pushes through with armor." The American forces guarding the pass were woefully inadequate. The 19th Combat Engineer Regiment had been tasked with defending the narrowest part of the pass, which was about 800 yards wide. They had begun work on a minefield, but it was largely incomplete. Supporting them was the 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment from the 1st Infantry Division, along with a meager armor contingent consisting of 8 M4 Sherman tanks and a battalion of M3 tank destroyers, which were actually just 75mm guns mounted on the back of half-tracks with minimal armor protection. Waters knew that if the Germans attacked in force, this thin defensive line would not hold for long. But orders were orders, and they would do their best with what they had. At 0830, the first signs of the German attack appeared. A squadron of Stuka dive bombers emerging from the east, their engines growling as they approached the pass. "Take cover!" Waters shouted, diving behind a boulder as the first bombs began to fall. The ground shook as explosions walked across the American positions. The Stukas were followed by a sustained artillery barrage that seemed to last an eternity. Shells screamed down from the surrounding heights, where the Germans had positioned their 105mm and 150mm howitzers during the night. When the artillery finally lifted, an eerie silence fell over the pass, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the distant rumble of engines. And then the Panzers appeared. The German attack was led by a battle group from the 10th Panzer Division, with Italian units of the Centauro Armored Division attached. The tanks advanced in a wedge formation, their commanders standing in the open turrets, confident in the face of what they perceived as minimal resistance. "Open fire!" Waters ordered, and the American defenders responded with everything they had. The 75mm guns of the tank destroyers fired from concealed positions, scoring several hits on the lead German tanks. But the return fire was devastating. German 88mm guns, the most feared anti-tank weapon of the war, opened up from positions on the flanks of the pass. One by one, the American tank destroyers were knocked out, their thin armor providing no protection against the German shells. By mid-morning, the situation had become desperate. The German infantry had dismounted from their half-tracks and were working their way around the American flanks, threatening to encircle the entire defensive position. "We have to fall back," Waters told his company commanders. "We'll establish a new defensive line 2 miles west of the pass." But even as the order to withdraw was being relayed, German tanks broke through the center of the American line. In the confusion that followed, many units became separated and were cut off. Private Thomas Riley of the 26th Infantry found himself isolated with a small group of men as the German tanks rolled past their position. "Stay down," he whispered to the terrified soldiers around him. "Let them pass, then we'll try to make it back to our lines after dark." Throughout the day, similar scenes played out across the battlefield as the American defense of Kasserine Pass disintegrated. By nightfall, the Germans had complete control of the pass and were pushing westward. The road to Tebessa now lay open. The horror of that day would be seared into the memories of those who survived. Men crushed by tanks as they huddled in their shallow scrapes. Soldiers cut down by machine gun fire as they fled across open ground. The wounded left behind in the hasty retreat, their fate in the hands of the advancing Germans. Kasserine Pass had become a gateway to hell, and through it poured the full might of Rommel's Afrika Korps. February 20, 1943, 10:30, west of Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The American retreat had become a rout. Vehicles clogged the narrow roads leading west, many abandoned due to lack of fuel or mechanical failures. Men marched in disorganized groups, some without weapons, many without officers. Captain James Hendricks of the 1st Infantry Division attempted to restore some order to the chaos. He stood at a crossroads, directing traffic and gathering stragglers into improvised units. "Fall in here," he shouted to a group of infantry passing by. "We're establishing a defensive position on that ridge." Some obeyed, but others continued walking, their eyes vacant with the thousand-yard stare of men who had seen too much horror too quickly. "Where's your weapon, soldier?" Hendricks demanded of one passing private. "Lost it, sir," the man replied, not meeting the captain's gaze. "Germans overran our position. Everyone else is dead." Hendricks had heard similar stories all morning. The German breakthrough had been devastating, catching many units still in their bivouac areas or strung out on the roads. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the physical losses. For many of the young American soldiers, this was their first experience of combat, and it had been a brutal introduction. Private William Foster sat by the side of the road, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. Beside him, another soldier stared blankly at the distant mountains. "They came out of nowhere," Foster said to no one in particular. "Tanks everywhere. Johnson caught one in the chest, blew him apart right next to me. His blood, it was all over me." He looked down at his uniform, which was indeed stained dark with dried blood. "I ran. God help me, I ran." Further west, at the Allied headquarters, the mood was one of barely controlled panic. Reports were coming in from all sectors, and none of them were good. The Germans had broken through at multiple points and were advancing rapidly. The 1st Armored Division was in retreat, having lost much of its equipment. The 1st Infantry Division was scattered, with many units cut off behind enemy lines. Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, commander of the British First Army, conferred urgently with his American counterpart, Major General Lloyd Friedendahl of 2nd Corps. "We must stabilize the line," Anderson insisted. "If Rommel reaches Tebessa, he'll threaten our entire position in Algeria." Friedendahl looked haggard, his confidence shattered by the rapid collapse of his forces. "I've ordered all available reserves forward," he said, "but it may be too late." The truth was that the Allied command structure was in disarray. Orders were being issued and countermanded. Units were being moved without coordination, and the overall strategic picture was unclear. In the midst of this chaos, one thing was becoming increasingly apparent. The Americans were on the verge of a catastrophic defeat that could potentially change the course of the North African campaign. As night fell on February 20, the situation reached its breaking point. German advance units had penetrated over 20 miles beyond Kasserine Pass, capturing key road junctions and threatening to split the Allied forces in two. The casualty reports were staggering. In just 2 days of fighting at Kasserine Pass, the Americans had lost over 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Dozens of tanks and artillery pieces had been destroyed or abandoned, and critical supply dumps had fallen into German hands. The darkness brought little respite, as German night patrols continued to probe the hastily established American defensive positions. The distant rumble of tank engines served as a constant reminder that the battle was far from over. For the men of the 1st Infantry Division, huddled in foxholes and behind rocky outcrops, it was the longest night of their lives. Many had not slept for days, and the strain of constant combat had pushed them to the edge of endurance. "Will they come again tomorrow?" a young replacement asked Sergeant Frank Valenti as they shared a foxhole. Valenti checked his Thompson submachine gun and nodded grimly. "They'll come, and we'll be ready for them." But as he said those words, even Valenti wasn't sure if they were true. The Germans had shown themselves to be masters of modern warfare, while the Americans were still learning, and learning the hard way, in blood and suffering. The next day would determine whether the U.S. Army in North Africa would survive as an effective fighting force or be shattered beyond recovery. February 21st, 1943, 0645, Thala Sector, Tunisia. Brigadier General Paul Robinette's Combat Command B, CCB, of 1st Armored Division had been ordered north to reinforce the defenses around Thala, a small town that now stood in the path of the German advance. With him were elements of Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen's 1st Infantry Division. Together they formed what Robinette called a thin line of steel, a combined arms team of infantry, tanks and hull-down positions, and anti-tank guns in mutually supporting emplacements. Dozens of artillery pieces were positioned on the reverse slopes of hills, their forward observers well concealed and their firing solutions pre-registered along likely avenues of approach. "If they come this way," Robinette told his officers, "they'll pay in blood for every yard." Allen, the commander of the 1st Infantry Division, was a controversial figure, hard-drinking, iconoclastic, and fiercely protective of his men. But he was also a superb combat commander who understood the realities of modern warfare. "Dig in deep," he ordered his infantry. "When the tanks come, let them pass over you, then hit the infantry that follows." It was a desperate gambit, but one born of necessity. The American forces had been badly mauled in the previous day's fighting, and morale was at a low ebb. If this line broke, there would be little left to stop Rommel's drive into Algeria. As dawn broke, the distant sound of tank engines could be heard approaching from the east. German reconnaissance units had identified the American positions during the night, and now the main force was moving up for the assault. At 08:30, the first German shells began to fall among the American positions. The artillery barrage was methodical, walking back and forth across the defensive line with precision. "Stay down!" Sergeant Michael Collins of the 16th Infantry Regiment shouted to his men as the earth erupted around them. "They're trying to get us to break and run." The barrage lasted for 45 minutes, then lifted suddenly. In the eerie silence that followed, the rumble of tank engines grew louder. "Here they come," Collins whispered, peering over the lip of his foxhole. The German attack was led by elements of the 10th Panzer Division, with infantry of the Afrika Korps in support. They advanced confidently, expecting to encounter the same disorganized resistance they had faced at Kasserine Pass. Instead, they ran into a wall of fire. American artillery, which had remained silent during the German barrage to avoid counter-battery fire, now opened up with devastating effect. 105mm and 155mm howitzers pounded the advancing German columns, while smaller caliber guns targeted the infantry. "Fire at will," Robinette ordered his tank commanders as the German armor came within range. The M4 Sherman tanks, positioned in hull-down positions behind ridges with only their turrets exposed, opened fire. Their 75mm guns might have been outmatched by the German 88s in terms of range and penetrating power, but at close quarters, they were deadly effective. The first wave of German tanks was hit hard. Several Panzer IVs brewed up, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular explosions that sent their turrets flying into the air. Others were immobilized by track hits or direct penetrations through their more vulnerable side armor. The German infantry, advancing behind the tanks, suddenly found themselves exposed to interlocking fields of machine gun fire. American 30 and 50 caliber machine guns cut down entire squads as they tried to find cover on the rocky ground. By mid-morning, the German attack had stalled. Rommel, who was observing the battle from a forward position, realized that the Americans had finally managed to establish a coherent defensive line. "They've learned quickly," he remarked to his staff officers. "This is not the same force we faced at Kasserine." Indeed, the American defenders at Thala were fighting with a determination born of desperation. They knew that this was where they had to make their stand, that there could be no further retreat. Throughout the day, the battle raged back and forth. The Germans launched several more attacks, each one beaten back with heavy losses. By late afternoon, the battlefield was littered with the burning wrecks of German and American tanks alike. As darkness fell, the firing gradually died down. The thin line had held, for now, but the cost had been high. Hundreds of American soldiers lay dead or wounded, and many of the surviving tanks had sustained damage that would take days to repair. In his command post, General Robinette received reports from his unit commanders. The news was grim, but not catastrophic. They had stopped the German advance, but another day of such fighting would exhaust their ammunition and reserves. "Can we hold if they come again tomorrow?" asked his operations officer. Robinette studied the map, then nodded slowly. "We can hold. We must hold." For the men on the line, it would be another sleepless night, waiting for the dawn and whatever horror it might bring. February 22, 1943, 0430, German Forward Headquarters, Tunisia. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel pored over the latest intelligence reports by the light of a kerosene lamp. The news was not encouraging. The American resistance at Thala had proven unexpectedly stubborn, and similar determined defenses had stalled German advances at other points along the front. "Fuel reserves are critical," reported his logistics officer. "We have enough for perhaps one more day of offensive operations. Then we must either capture Allied supply dumps or begin withdrawing." Rommel nodded thoughtfully. He had always been a gambler, willing to take calculated risks for potentially high rewards. But he was also a realist, who understood the limitations of his forces. "And ammunition?" he asked. "The situation is similar, Herr Feldmarschall. The artillery in particular has expended far more shells than anticipated." Rommel turned to his operations map, where the positions of both German and Allied forces were marked with colored pins. The breakthrough at Kasserine Pass had been impressive, but the American and British forces were recovering from their initial shock and beginning to coordinate their defense effectively. More concerning was the news from the south, where the British Eighth Army under General Montgomery was advancing steadily toward the Mareth Line. If they broke through there while Rommel's forces were committed in the west, the result could be catastrophic. "We must make a decision," Rommel told his staff. "Either we commit everything to a final push toward Tebessa, or we consolidate our gains and withdraw to the eastern dorsal." The choice before him was stark. A successful drive to Tebessa might severely disrupt Allied operations in Tunisia and potentially change the course of the North African campaign. But failure would leave his forces overextended and vulnerable to counterattack. After a brief consultation with his senior commanders, Rommel made his decision. They would launch one more coordinated assault on the Allied positions, focusing on what intelligence suggested was the weakest point in their line, the junction between the American and British sectors. Orders were quickly disseminated, and by dawn, the German forces were in motion. This would be Rommel's final gambit, an all-or-nothing thrust that would either break the Allied line or exhaust the offensive potential of the Afrika Korps. What Rommel could not know was that the Allies had been reinforced during the night. Fresh artillery batteries had been brought up, and the defensive positions had been strengthened with anti-tank guns and minefields. Most significantly, the command confusion that had plagued the initial Allied response to the German offensive was being resolved. At 0715, the German attack began with a brief but intense artillery barrage, followed by the advance of tank and infantry formations. But as they moved forward, they encountered a level of resistance far beyond what they had faced in the previous days. American artillery, directed by forward observers with clear lines of sight, pounded the German columns with devastating accuracy. Anti-tank guns, carefully sighted to provide interlocking fields of fire, picked off German tanks one by one, and the American infantry, having learned the hard way about the importance of proper defensive positions, remained firmly in place despite the German pressure. By mid-morning, the German attack had stalled completely. Rommel, observing from a forward position, realized that the opportunity for a decisive breakthrough had passed. "Order a general withdrawal to the eastern dorsal," he told his chief of staff. "We will defend the Mareth line against Montgomery's advance." It was a difficult decision, but a necessary one. The Battle of Kasserine Pass had reached its culmination point, and Rommel recognized that further offensive operations would only deplete his forces without achieving strategic gains. As the German units began their methodical withdrawal, they left behind a battlefield littered with the detritus of modern warfare: burned-out tanks, shattered artillery pieces, and the bodies of the fallen from both sides. The cost had been high for attacker and defender alike, but the Americans had at last found their footing against the vaunted Afrika Korps. For Rommel, the withdrawal marked the beginning of the end of his North African campaign. He would never again have the opportunity or the resources to launch a major offensive. Within months, his forces would be trapped between the advancing British Eighth Army from the east and the reorganized American and British forces from the west. The Desert Fox had played his final card, and though he had inflicted significant damage on the Allied forces, it had not been enough to change the strategic equation in North Africa. February 23, 1943, 1420, Field Hospital near Thala, Tunisia. The screams of the wounded filled the air as Dr. James Harlow moved from patient to patient in the overcrowded medical tent. The floor was slick with blood, despite the orderly's best efforts to keep it clean. "More morphine," Harlow called out, kneeling beside a soldier whose legs had been shredded by artillery fire. The man's face was ashen from blood loss, his eyes wide with shock and pain. "We're almost out, doctor," replied the nurse, her uniform stained with blood and dirt. Harlow cursed under his breath. The casualties from the battle had overwhelmed the medical facilities. Every tent was filled to capacity, and many of the wounded lay on stretchers in the open air, protected only by canvas awnings from the harsh sun. In the triage area, medical personnel made the grim calculations that war necessitates, determining who could be saved with immediate treatment, who could wait, and who was beyond help and should be made comfortable in their final hours. "This one goes to surgery next," ordered the triage officer, pointing to a soldier with a sucking chest wound. "And give this man morphine. There's nothing more we can do for him." The brutal reality of combat was laid bare in these field hospitals. Men arrived with horrific injuries, limbs torn off by high explosives, bodies riddled with machine gun fire, faces burned beyond recognition by tank rounds that had ignited fuel and ammunition. Private Thomas Kelly had been brought in with severe burns after his half-track was hit by a German 88. As the nurses carefully cut away his charred uniform, he spoke through cracked, blistered lips. "Did we hold them?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Did we stop the bastards?" "Yes," the nurse told him, her eyes filling with tears. "We stopped them. They're pulling back." Kelly managed a small smile before losing consciousness. He would not survive the night. One more name to be added to the growing list of American dead. Outside the medical tents, chaplains of various faiths moved among the wounded, offering comfort and performing last rites for the dying. Letters were written home, personal effects were collected to be sent to families, and dog tags were removed from those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The battle had exacted a terrible toll. The official casualty figures would later record that the U.S. forces suffered over 6,000 men killed, wounded, or captured during the Kasserine operations. Hundreds of vehicles had been destroyed or captured, along with valuable equipment and supplies. But statistics could not capture the true horror of what had occurred. Each number represented a human life ended or forever changed, a family that would receive a telegram beginning with the dreaded words, "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you." By the evening of February 23, as the fighting died down and the German forces continued their withdrawal, the full scale of the disaster began to become apparent. Burial details moved across the battlefield, collecting the dead. Many bodies had lain in the open for days, and the desert heat had accelerated decomposition, making identification difficult in some cases. "I never imagined it could be like this," said a young medic to Dr. Harlow as they took a brief break outside the surgery tent. "In training, they talk about casualties, but this..." Harlow, a veteran of the First World War, simply nodded. "This is the reality of war," he said quietly. "Not the parades and flags, but this, blood and pain and death. And the ones who survive will carry it with them forever." Indeed, the psychological wounds would in many cases prove as debilitating as the physical ones. Combat fatigue, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected many of the men who had endured the horrors of Kasserine. Some would be evacuated for psychiatric treatment, while others would continue to serve despite their inner turmoil. As night fell over the battlefield, the moans of the wounded continued. Stars appeared in the clear desert sky, indifferent to the human suffering below. The Battle of Faid Pass was over, but its bloody toll would be felt for years to come. February 25, 1943, 10 o'clock, Faid Pass, Tunisia. 2 days after the German withdrawal, American forces cautiously reoccupied the pass. The scene that greeted them was one of utter devastation. Major Robert Harkins of the 1st Infantry Division surveyed the battlefield from the same rocky outcrop where Lieutenant Colonel Waters had stood a week earlier. The narrow defile was littered with the wreckage of war, burned-out tanks and half-tracks, shattered artillery pieces, and abandoned equipment of all kinds. "It looks like hell itself opened up here," remarked his aide, Lieutenant James Wilson. Harkins nodded grimly. In a way, it did. The air was heavy with the smell of death. Despite the best efforts of the burial details, not all of the bodies had yet been recovered. Many lay where they had fallen, now bloated and discolored under the North African sun. Engineers worked to clear the roads of debris and mines, while recovery teams attempted to salvage damaged vehicles and equipment. Medical personnel continued to search for wounded who might have been overlooked in the chaos of battle. In the nearby town of Kasserine, the civilian population was slowly emerging from hiding. The battle had swept over them like a deadly tide, leaving destruction in its wake. Many homes had been damaged or destroyed by artillery fire, and essential services like water and electricity were non-existent. An elderly Arab man approached Major Harkins, gesturing toward the mountains. "Many dead," he said in broken English. "Americans, Germans, all dead. For what?" It was a question without an easy answer. The strategic significance of the battle was still being debated in Allied headquarters. Had it been a disaster or merely a setback? Had the lessons learned been worth the terrible cost? What was clear was that changes were coming. General Lloyd Friedendahl, whose poor tactical decisions had contributed significantly to the American defeat, was relieved of command of Second Corps. His replacement would be Major General George S. Patton, a leader whose aggressive style was seen as the antidote to Friedendahl's cautious and disjointed approach. Throughout the American forces, a period of intense introspection began. What had gone wrong? How could such errors be prevented in the future? The answers would reshape the U.S. Army's approach to modern warfare. One of the most significant lessons was the importance of combined arms operations. Tanks could not operate effectively without infantry support, and both needed artillery and air power to be truly effective. The piecemeal commitment of forces that had characterized the American response to Rommel's offensive would not be repeated. Another lesson was the critical nature of leadership, particularly at the small unit level. Many American officers had been found wanting in the crucible of combat, either through inexperience or temperament. A process of weeding out the unfit began, with combat performance now the ultimate arbiter of an officer's worth. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, who had borne much of the brunt of the fighting, emerged from Kasserine with a new identity, that of veterans who had faced the best the German army could throw at them, and ultimately held their ground. The Big Red One would go on to distinguish itself throughout the rest of the war, from Sicily to Normandy and beyond. As Major Harkins completed his survey of the battlefield, he noticed a small group of soldiers erecting a crude wooden cross at the site where a particularly fierce engagement had taken place. "What's that for?" he asked the sergeant in charge. "Just marking where we found a bunch of our boys, sir," the sergeant replied. "Seemed like they ought to be remembered." Harkins nodded. "Carry on, Sergeant. They should indeed be remembered." The lessons of Kasserine had been purchased at a terrible price. Over 6,000 American casualties. But from this bloody baptism, the U.S. Army had emerged tempered and hardened, ready for the long road to Berlin that lay ahead. And for the men who had survived, there was a grim satisfaction in knowing that they had finally stopped Rommel's advance. The myth of the Desert Fox's invincibility had been shattered, and with it, any doubts about the American soldiers' ability to stand toe-to-toe with the Wehrmacht. The Battle of Faid Pass was over, but the war and its horrors would continue for more than 2 years to come. March 1, 1943, 0930, Allied Headquarters, Algiers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in North Africa, studied the after-action reports spread across his desk. The detailed accounts of the Battle of Faid Pass made for sobering reading. "Over 6,000 casualties," he said quietly to General Walter Bedell Smith, his chief of staff. "All those lives lost, and we're essentially back where we started before Rommel's offensive." Smith nodded gravely. "It was a hard lesson, sir, but perhaps a necessary one." Eisenhower rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the Mediterranean Sea. The brilliant blue waters gave no hint of the bloody struggle taking place just a few hundred miles to the east. The British were right about our inexperience, he acknowledged, but they were wrong to think we couldn't learn and adapt. And adapt they had. In the weeks following the battle, a comprehensive reorganization of American forces in North Africa had been undertaken. General Patton had taken command of II Corps, infusing it with his trademark aggressive spirit. Training had been intensified, with a particular focus on combined arms operations and anti-tank tactics. Most importantly, the command structure had been streamlined. The 18th Army Group had been created under British General Sir Harold Alexander, providing a unified command for all Allied ground forces in Tunisia. This addressed one of the most critical failures during the Kasserine battle, the lack of coordination between American, British, and French units. Patton reports that morale is improving, Smith said. The men want a chance to prove themselves against Rommel. Eisenhower nodded. They'll get that chance soon enough, but we need to make sure they're properly prepared this time. The lessons of Kasserine had been burned into the collective consciousness of the American forces. Never again would they underestimate their German opponents. Never again would they attack without proper reconnaissance and support. Never again would they allow their units to be isolated and defeated in detail. For the survivors of the battle, the experience had been transformative. Men who had arrived in North Africa as green replacements had been forged in the crucible of combat into hardened veterans. Those who had broken under the strain had been removed from frontline duty, while those who had shown courage and initiative had been promoted. The 1st Infantry Division, in particular, had emerged from Kasserine with a new identity, that of a battle-tested unit that had faced the worst the enemy could throw at them and survived. This reputation would only grow in the campaigns to come, as the Big Red One fought its way through Sicily, Italy, and eventually France and Germany. But the shadow of Kasserine would linger over the American forces for the remainder of the war. The memory of those terrible days in February 1943 would serve as both a cautionary tale and a source of grim determination. Never again would American soldiers be so unprepared for the realities of modern warfare. "Sir," said Smith, interrupting Eisenhower's thoughts, "the latest intelligence indicates that Rommel is consolidating his forces along the Mareth line. Montgomery's 8th Army is approaching from the east. It looks like the next major battle will be there." Eisenhower turned from the window. "Then we need to be ready to strike when the time comes. Rommel may have won at Kasserine, but he's about to find out that the American army learns from its mistakes." Indeed, less than a month later, American forces would win their first significant victory over the Germans at the Battle of El Ghoutar. The lessons of Kasserine, bought with blood, would be applied with deadly effectiveness against their former teachers. The nightmare of Kasserine Pass had ended, but its influence would shape the American war effort for years to come. The horror experienced there would never be forgotten by those who lived through it, but neither would the hard-won wisdom gained from that bloody failure. In the end, perhaps that was the true significance of Kasserine, not as an American defeat, but as the crucible in which a truly formidable fighting force was born. January 30, 2023, 1645. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. 80 years after the battle, the Kasserine Pass still cuts through the mountains of central Tunisia like a wound in the earth. The landscape has changed little since 1943. The same jagged rocks, the same harsh terrain, the same unforgiving sun beating down from above. Dr. Michael Atkinson, grandson of the historian Rick Atkinson, and himself a military historian specializing in the North African campaign, stands on a rocky outcrop overlooking the pass. With him is Ahmed Bouazizi, a local guide whose grandfather witnessed the battle as a young boy. "It's hard to imagine what happened here," Atkinson says, surveying the peaceful scene below. "Thousands of men fighting and dying in this narrow space." Bouazizi nods. "My grandfather told me stories of how the earth shook for days, how the sky was black with smoke and the nights were lit by burning tanks, how the screams of the wounded could be heard even in the village, 5 kilometers away. Despite the passage of time, reminders of the battle can still be found. Occasional shell casings emerge from the soil after heavy rains. the rusted remains of a German half-track lie partially buried in a dry riverbed. And in the small museum in the town of Kasserine, photographs and artifacts tell the story of those terrible days in February 1943. The Americans who fought here were mostly young men, far from home, Atkinson says. Many had never even heard of Tunisia before being sent to fight here. For them, this remote mountain pass became a place of unspeakable horror. Indeed, for the men of the 1st Infantry Division and the other American units that fought at Kasserine, the experience would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Those who survived would go on to fight in Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany, carrying with them the hard-won wisdom of their baptism by fire in the mountains of Tunisia. The last veterans of the battle are now gone, the final witnesses to the horror that unfolded here having passed away in recent years. But their stories live on. In letters home, in oral histories recorded by museums and universities, in the memoirs some wrote in their later years. And in these accounts, the reality of war emerges with stark clarity. Not the sanitized version presented in movies or recruitment posters, but the true face of combat, terrifying, chaotic, and brutally indifferent to human life. My grandfather never spoke much about what he saw here, Bouazizi says, but once when I was a teenager, he told me something I never forgot. He said, "War makes men into animals, and animals into men." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I think I do now. Atkinson nods. The men who fought here experienced humanity at its worst and its best, unimaginable cruelty and violence, but also incredible courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. That's the paradox of war. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the pass, Atkinson takes one last look at the battlefield. In his mind's eye, he can almost see the tanks and infantry moving across the terrain, hear the thunder of artillery, and the rattle of machine guns. For a moment, the ghosts of Kasserine seem to rise around him. The young men of the 1st Infantry Division, the veteran soldiers of the Afrika Korps, all caught in the maelstrom of history. Then the moment passes, and there is only the wind whispering through the rocks, carrying with it the faint echo of a battle long ended, but never truly forgotten. The horror of Kasserine Pass lives on, not in the peaceful landscape that has healed its physical scars, but in the collective memory of nations and armies that learned its bloody lessons. And in that memory lies perhaps the most important legacy of those who fought and died here, the knowledge of war's true face, stripped of glory and revealed in all its terrible reality. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.